but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
That was Prime Minister Tony Blair speaking live on Talksport. Let's get a quick recap of the day's events so far with Martin Smedley.
Thanks, John. America's in a state of shock after the world's worst terrorist attack. It's feared thousands of people may be dead after a trail of destruction, which started just over 5 hours ago. Sky's Matthew Farrell reports.
New York's famous World Trade Center towers have been reduced to rubble. 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the 110-story skyscrapers minutes apart around 2 o'clock UK time. Around 50,000 people work there. It's the world's largest commercial complex. This woman works just around the corner.
Tons of people were running down Fulton Street, running each other over, and I made my way back to my office on Water Street. And when I got upstairs, I looked out my window to see what was going on, and the Second World Trade Center just went into flames.
Just after 2:30, a third commercial plane landed on the Pentagon, the U.S. military headquarters, demolishing one corner of the building outside Washington. It soon emerged that a fourth aircraft had been reported missing. Soon after, it crash-landed by Somerset County Airport near Pittsburgh at around 3:30. American Airlines and United Airways have lost 2 planes each, carrying a total of 266 people. Tonight, parts of the White House remain evacuated amid fear of further terrorist acts, and American fighter aircraft are patrolling the skies. President George W. Bush is promising to hunt down those responsible. All U.S. land borders have been closed.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Here, the Queen's expressed her growing disbelief and total shock. The Prime Minister's described the outrage as the most terrible, shocking event, and the Tory party's postponing tomorrow's planned leadership declaration as a mark of respect. Matthew Farrell, Sky News.
Now here's what we know about the hijacked planes. The 2 that hit the World Trade Center are reported both to be American Airlines jets, a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles with 92 people on board, and a Boeing 757 from Washington bound for Los Angeles, also carrying about 64 people. A United Airlines 757 from Newark to San Francisco with 38 passengers, 2 pilots and 5 attendants on board crashed in Pennsylvania. And a United Airlines 767 with 65 people on board also lost. The airline hasn't said where that crashed, and we're not quite sure about the airline that's crashed into the Pentagon either. New York's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's advised people to leave the lower part of the city. Much of the subway system's been shut down and traffic's being allowed to leave Manhattan, but not to come in. Hospitals in the city are in emergency mode. Barbara Reed is from the Lenox Hill Hospital in New York.
Right now, what we're doing, we're seeing a lot of people coming from the streets, just stopping by the hospital. You know, there's a long line outside our hospital to donate blood.
Pope John Paul's condemned the attacks as unspeakable horror. In a telegram to President Bush, he expressed his profound sorrow. Palestinians at a refugee camp in Lebanon have reacted to the attacks with jubilant gunfire, dancing and cheering. Many have taken to the streets waving flags and giving out sweets. Meanwhile, Palestinian President Yasser Arafat is another leader to condemn the attacks. And Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement says Osama bin Laden wasn't behind them. The Saudi dissident is taking shelter in the country. The spokesman says he doesn't have the capability. Just recapping on the top story, 2 hijacked planes have crashed into and destroyed the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. A third hit the Pentagon. Another has gone down in Pittsburgh. American fighter aircraft are now patrolling the skies, ready to shoot down any more terrorist planes that might be there. Finally, the Foreign Office is warning British citizens overseas to take extra care, and there's an emergency number for anyone worried about relatives in the States. The number is 0207 008 0000. That's 0207 008 0000. That's the latest for now from the Sky News Centre. We'll have more updates through the evening.
Thank you, Martin. As Martin was saying there, Mike, the Taliban claiming that bin Laden wasn't behind the attacks, but frankly, there's no evidence to suggest what they say is true. Simply the fact that because the Taliban are the ruling organisation in Afghanistan, that would give some kind of target who the US and the rest of the civilised world could direct their vengeance towards, and that's what they're trying to avoid, because as it stands, it's one man in his organisation, of one very highly organised, fanatical organisation with people who are prepared to lay down their lives for some crazy cause of destroying the rest of the world and the people who don't share the same religious beliefs as them. But what on earth can anybody do?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, when the Taliban say he was not involved, that's a bit like the Irish government saying we don't think the IRA were involved. But the Irish government don't really know if the IRA are involved or not, because they're a secret organisation who work in their own ways, out of the normal order of society. Now, Osama bin Laden, who is holed up in Afghanistan, we know that for sure, somewhere in Afghanistan, he isn't going to tell the ruling Taliban of what his plans are for tomorrow or the day after. They won't have a clue what he's up to. All they're saying is that they have no evidence that he's involved and that they would in no way support anything he's done. But nevertheless, he's the most wanted man in America. He's wanted in connection with a 1998 bombing, the famous or infamous August the 7th bombing of the United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi and Kenya. Those attacks were all coordinated and killed over 200 people. He is considered armed and the most extremely dangerous person in opposition to the United States. Now, already Washington is saying that he's the chief suspect, right? Now, it was interesting when we were talking to our friend Don, who is the European editor of Time magazine, a bit earlier on, who'd only just flown in from Boston today, but he said it's the lack of rhetoric which is so far puzzling him. And what he means by that is demands for vengeance so far haven't come. I think that's for two reasons. Firstly, I think the Americans are being very measured in trying to find out who's responsible definitively before they start beating the drum. And then secondly, of course, the whole nation is still in a state of terrible shock, and it's more important at the moment to evacuate Manhattan and get the rescue operation into full swing before they start talking about vengeance and what they're going to do next.
It's one of these terrible ironies, bin Laden. Now, it's denied by the CIA in recent times, but early parts of his career, it's suspected that he was funded and set up because he was as you said earlier, Mike, he was a dissident Saudi millionaire. He was a young man who went to fight against the Russians, and that's where he developed his fundamental approach. And of course, at that time, it was in the Cold War, it was in the interest of the Americans to fund him, and some of his people and his troops were seen with American made weaponry and missiles.
Yeah, well, absolutely right, John. I mean, we all know about Afghanistan. Afghanistan was invaded by the Russians during the rule of President Jimmy Carter. It did for Carter because Carter was seen not to be a tough enough president to persuade the Russians not to mess around with him. And I don't know if you recall, John, because you're a bit younger than me, but the Russians actually moved into Afghanistan. They invaded on Christmas Day, when the Western world, of course, was dozing, and they never pulled out for many, many years until their own forces started to rebel against the occupation. But I mean, that was a terrible blow for America. Jimmy Carter didn't survive it. He was one of the few presidents in post-war to have served only one term of office because of that. And you're absolutely right. During those days, the Americans were desperate to try and find some support within Afghanistan. Now, as you quite rightly say, old bin Laden in those days was a young Robin Hood type figure, fundamentally Islamic, and he was going around the world with the money that he has from his massively wealthy Saudi Arabian family, recruiting people like Egyptians, Lebanese, Turks, other people, all to join the fight for their Afghan Muslim brothers in what they saw was a struggle against communism. Although the Western world is pitted against communism, has been for the whole of the post-war Cold War period, also, so are the Muslims. They dislike communism as much as the West did. And he was recruiting people, he was buying bulldozers and building defences throughout Afghanistan. He was a pain and a thorn in the side of the Russians all the time that they were in Afghanistan. And as you quite rightly say, inevitably, anybody opposing the Russians, my enemy's enemy is my friend. The United States were funding bin Laden to fight the Russians and cause them internal difficulties whilst they were still working out a way of getting them out of Afghanistan.
And then the terrible consequences have come home today at just before 9 o'clock in the US, or in New York.